So we hear about that. But the bottom line, I think we all agree, we need a new approach. And that's what I want to leave you with before I turn the floor over to Sam Huang to talk about the case for Questcor. We need a new narrative in order to get that new approach because of this curve. So this blue curve is the percent of healthcare costs in the United States over time. As of last year, we spent 17.8% of GDP on healthcare. And the red line is the UK's expenditure. And I don't care about the levels. The UK is a smaller country and there are other issues, but the fact is that the UK has managed to change their curve so it's downward sloping. And that may actually be associated with what NICE has been doing. We are not yet able to do that. And Warren Buffett has actually pointed out just today that it's not taxes that's going to be a problem. It's going to be healthcare costs that will be a problem. But I don't think it's a problem in the same way that Warren Buffett does. And let me tell you how I differ from his views. Obviously, 17.8% of US GDP is a crazy number to spend on healthcare. That's $3.2 trillion we spent last year on healthcare. But you know why we spent it? We spent it, first of all, because we're a rich country. We can afford it. And the second reason we spent it is because we're actually getting stuff for it. We're developing a lot of the cures that I described early on, like Jimmy Carter. And so we're getting value out of it. What we ought to be scared about is not the fact that these numbers are what they are now, but rather we can actually afford a lot more. In other words, I believe that our country can afford to spend 35% of our GDP on healthcare. I'm not saying it's a good idea. I'm saying that we can afford it, and that's the scary part. And the reason it's scary is because, let me turn it to you and ask you to imagine if your father or mother had a life-threatening illness, or your child or sibling. Let me ask you this. If that were the case, what fraction of your income or wealth would you be willing to spend to help your loved one? Would you be willing to spend 17.8% of your income? Yep. Would you be willing to spend 40% of your income? Yep. Would you be willing to spend 80% of your income? Yep. You see the problem? Scientists are developing cures for all sorts of life-threatening diseases. So they're presenting us with all of these opportunities. And it's going to be very hard for us not to spend the money. Jayesh and then Guido.
Because it's not the absolute level of money we spend, but perhaps in other countries they're able to get very similar outcomes by spending lower amounts of money. So it's about the efficiency that you get from every dollar that's spent, as opposed to just saying, okay, let's spend 35% GDP or 100%.
So absolutely, if we can go to a single payer system, that would improve the economic outcomes and we'd lower our cost of capital and be able to save quite a bit of money. But having said that, I'll make the counter argument that the pharma companies have made, which is that the United States is the biggest market in the world for new drugs. And it's the one that pays the most, and that's why all new drugs are generally first introduced in the US, and why we, in the United States, get access to the full spectrum of drugs, whereas if you're in Europe or in Asia, you do not get access to all of the drugs we have here. And for many people, that's what they like about the United States. This is the cost. It's not free, we pay for it. So you're absolutely right. If we can trim some of that fat, we might do better. But if we want access to the very best drugs at the moment they're available, we're going to end up paying for it. So let me wrap up because I want to have time for Sam to talk about the case. I want to just wrap up with a couple of observations about why I'm worried about healthcare costs. It's not because of the usual reasons. I actually think there's tremendous cures and therapies that are being developed that we're going to want and we're going to value and that we can afford, and it's going to be very difficult to say no unless we start being a bit more rational about it. And a classic example is something that an amazing therapy being developed by Spark Therapeutics. This is a drug company that's developing a gene therapy to cure blindness. Cure blindness. In a clinical trial of about 40 patients, which included these two lovely individuals, Caroline and Cole, they have a genetic defect that causes a particular kind of congenital blindness. In clinical trials over the course of the last year, they can now see. Let me repeat that. They were blind and now they see. So Carolyn in particular said, I went outside when it was snowing and I was like, oh, I can see the snowflakes. It was really cool to actually see something that I've never seen in my life before. You tell me how you say no to that. How do you say no to that? If they price it at $1 million, would you pay? If you were a parent of Caroline and Cole, would you pay for this? Would you do whatever you could? Would you mortgage your house, sell your car, give up everything in order to let your kids see? That's what I'm afraid of. The opportunities are growing for developing cures like this. We need to find a better way to think about healthcare costs systematically because nobody is going to want to say no. In order to choose, you're actually saying no, not just to therapies, you are saying no to people. Who do you choose to help and who do you not choose? That's the narrative. So one possibility, a new business model that I want to tell you about is to change the way we deal with diseases to allow certain kinds of fee structures to occur. And this really comes about by the idea of creating kind of a last resort clinic. Thinking about developing new therapies, an example that happened a few years ago, Lucas Wortman was a researcher that developed acute lymphoblastic leukemia, no cure for it, dead in 3 years according to statistics. And his friends ended up sequencing his genes and figuring out that there was a kidney cancer drug that actually seemed to suppress a particularly overexpressed gene. And they gave it to him, and after a few months, he was cured of leukemia. This is not a fluke. Over the course of the last couple of years, more and more people have started mining genetic data to come up with these incredible, unusual, unpredictable kinds of therapies that are not part of standard of care treatment that seem to work. So imagine this clinic, this last resort clinic, that has exclusively high net worth investors as its initial clientele. And this clinic takes cases one at a time, 24/7, 365, no holds barred effort to develop an experimental therapy. And they'll do every kind of test that you can imagine to be able to figure out whether or not there's anything. These are not even drugs that are on the market, but just experimental compounds that might actually suppress certain kinds of genes and engage in these experimentation. And the hedge fund fee structure is what drives this. In other words, if they're able to produce a therapy that gives you better than 2 sigma standard of care results, then you pay 2.5% of your net worth. And if they don't, then you pay time and materials. What do you think of this? After you do this and develop therapies for these high net worth individuals, you take those therapies and you give it away for free to everybody else. So where is this clinic? It doesn't exist. Not yet. We tried. A couple of years ago, a bunch of students and I worked on trying to see whether we could create something like this. We actually had the benefit of help from folks at the Harvard Crowd Innovation Lab, as well as Beth Israel, Vikas Sukhatme, the chief medical officer, and a number of you actually were participating in that working group. We came very close. We had a structure that was proposed, but legally, it turns out it's impossible to do this in the US for all sorts of reasons. But this might actually be an approach to dealing with it. In order to do that, we're actually going to have to start thinking about ethical issues and how you choose. But this is one way to deal with this me hurt you perspective.